Anyway, so as presented, my talk today is on the Flora of Samoa. This is, I did it basically from 1971 until next year. I just turned in the draft to the National Tropical Botanical Garden last week, and I'm waiting for the repercussions because we have a different opinion of how it should be published. Okay, almost all you know where Samoa is, but just as a refresher, Samoa is right in the middle of what's called the Polynesian Triangle. Right here, it's equidistant between Hawaii to the north, which is the north point of this triangle, Easter Island's in the east corner, and New Zealand's on the south corner. So it's almost halfway between Hawaii and New Zealand. A little bit larger representation of the archipelago. It's divided politically into two parts. What used to be called Western Samoa, now called Samoa, is comprised of Savaii and Upolu, the two biggest islands of the chain. And American Samoa has Tutuila, a very small island of Vanu'u, and the Manua Islands, Ofu, Olosenga, and Ta'u, as well as an outlier, Rose Atoll, which is off the map, and so is Swains off to the top. Now, it's a little confusing when I say the word Samoa, but I refer to the whole archipelago. So if I'm trying to distinguish the western portion, Western Samoa, I usually say independent Samoa and American Samoa. The total area of Samoa is 3,030 square kilometers, so that makes it 1/88th as big as New Zealand, and yet it has probably 1/4 the flora. 93% of the whole area of the archipelago is in the western portion. That's where I've spent most of my time, but I've been to all the islands. I haven't landed on Rose, I have on Swains, but most of the mountaintops and so forth. These islands are volcanic. They were formed by volcanoes, undersea volcanoes that came up over what's called a hot spot. And this is a picture actually from a couple of years ago in Tonga when a new island formed there. And when this goes on for a couple of million years, it builds up and it produced this archipelago called Samoa now. The youngest, I always thought when I was in Samoa that the oldest part of the island were American Samoa because the volcanic activity, the recent 1760s and early 1900s was in Savaii, but apparently Savaii is the oldest part. It formed the whole archipelago and then there's secondary eruptions. So the lava flows are only on Savaii, the recent ones. It's located in the southern hemisphere. It's at 14 degrees south, so that's in the middle of the tropics. So that means it's very warm and humid all year round. It's 80% typical daytime humidity, which can be, if you have a trade wind, it's not too bad, but certain times of the year it is bad. There's a dry season, I should put that in quotes, because it's only half as dry as the wet season. And so most of the rain falls from November to April. And there's no month with insignificant amounts, so there's no water stress. Therefore, the vegetation, the natural vegetation of the archipelago is tropical rainforest, except for some minor other types, which I'll just briefly discuss. The lowest rainfall anywhere in Samoa is 80 centimeters per year. That's on the very western end of Savaii. A few years ago, I did this book. This was sort of an elaboration of my PhD, actually. I did it on the vegetation of Samoa. And just to be able to discuss these different types, I divided into 6 different categories and further divided those into different plant communities. I'll go over each of those briefly right now. When the Samoans first arrived in the archipelago, perhaps 3,000 years ago, almost 90% probably of the island was covered with tropical rainforest. And it varies, there's a lot of variation in these rainforests. On the coast, I call it coastal forest, and in the mountains you have cloud forest and montane forest. So it's a very wet, lush tropical rainforest island, almost all of it. And one of the characteristics of rainforests, tropical rainforest, is a profusion of epiphytes. On the right, you can see the tree that's covered with a large number of mosses, lichens, algae, and orchids, particularly orchids and ferns. Littoral strand, this is the area on the coast. It differs in rainforest in a number of ways. One, the species there are seawater dispersed. Almost all of them are seawater or seabird dispersed, which is different from the tropical rainforest. You go in just 100 meters, the trees will be an entirely different method of dispersal. And it's a very narrow zone, and it's often divided into subzones based on the physiognomy, the type of vegetation. In this picture, you have grasses and sedges here on the coast of Savaii, and this is the coast of Tutuila. You have shrubs, Scaevola. And this one on Ofu Island, you can see there's no herbaceous vegetation here, but you have this sort of a tree or shrub here, and then another Pisonia tree in the background. So most of these, as I said, are, most of them are indigenous. You have no endemic species in this part of the Samoan forests. Wetlands, divided in two basic categories. Marshes are wetlands with herbaceous cover, and swamps are wetlands with tree cover. And there are several types of marshes and bogs and so forth. I won't go into that now, but you can see this crater on the backbone of Upolu, just behind Apia. You have the wetland marsh around the edges. And just a couple of kilometers to the east, this is another crater, and you can see it's dominated by this plant, which is the sedge, leafless sedge, Elaeocharis. There are two types of forests, wetland forests. One are freshwater ones, and these are usually along estuaries and sometimes along edges of the lake, some of the lakes. And the other type are mangroves, which are growing in saline soil, always on the coast, in embayments and so forth. So very different flora in these two types of forest, but they're both wetland forests. Another couple of interesting types, they actually occupy a very small area of Samoa, and I call them collectively upland scrub. The left picture and the one in the middle are both taken from the very top of Ta'u at about 900 meters elevation. You can see it's not really a forest, it's just a dense scrub dominated by ferns and vines and short trees and shrubs and orchids and so forth. And this vegetation is probably not a forest because of so much rain up there. That's my guess anyway, that the soil is so soggy, the trees just can't stand up in the wind. The other type is totally unrelated, but it's shaped a similar type of vegetation, different species though. Well, some of the species are the same. It's called montane scrub, and it only occurs on the island of Tutuila on old volcanic cones, the remnants of old volcanic cones with a special kind of soil called trachyte. You can see there, it's a white soil. Normally that would be black basalt, but this is a very light, almost chalk-colored soil. So these are just two examples of vegetation types that allow more Samoan diversity, because of different habitats for plants to become established and new arrivals to become established in. One of the most interesting type are the lava flows. The volcanic vegetation is lava flows, cinder cones, and other types of volcanic landscapes. And this, as I said before, it occurs only on the island of Savaii. The most recent one was 1903 to 1911, and an older one, they were guessing about 1760. And two of these, actually one from each of the two times, have a lava flow that goes from the inland area all the way down to the coast. So again, the species here are quite different than the rainforest because they're sun-loving plants and so forth, so it gives more species diversity to Samoa, more opportunity for diversity. This is a map of Savaii, and the one lava flow, this is the 1760 flow, it's called Aopo, there's the village of Aopo. And this one, 1903, 1911, somewhere around there, and it went all the way to the coast. This is about 600 meters elevation. The vegetation down here is different than here just because of elevation and rainfall. And there's two smaller areas up here from about the beginning of the century, the early 1900s. So that's all the recent lava flows on Samoa. Very fascinating studying it, easy to walk through, easy to find the plants because they're all short. The last type is disturbed vegetation, and before people came to Samoa, there was very little of this. There were just natural disturbances. There was forest fires were probably rare, if ever. Cyclones would knock down the forest once in a while, but it would still be native species. It wouldn't have changed much. It'll always go back to the rainforest if you give it enough time. I divide the disturbed vegetation, which probably occupies now 50% of the archipelago, divided in managed land vegetation. It's like this one here. This is a alocasia or tapu plantation being managed by growing plants on it. If that's abandoned, you have secondary scrub for a few years, and eventually certain secondary forest trees take over and make a high forest, but different species concentration or composition than the tropical rainforest. And most of these in the managed lands are, well, a lot of them are weeds. Now, fernlands, some places, well, like Cook Islands, some of the older Cook Islands, you have lots of fernland there. You know, it's just because it's been burned so many times. But in Samoa, it's only 2 places, basically, on the island of Upolu. And you're seeing almost half of the fernlands there in Samoa. And there's another, this is on the north coast at Solo, or Utuli, or somewhere, right, just east of Apia. And there's another one on the east end of the island. Well, so much for vegetation, but Samoa has the largest native flora in tropical Polynesia except for Hawaii, which has a much larger area. And even though the vegetation has been removed, half of it has been removed, it still has the highest percent of intact native forest. And you can see the inland area of Savaii. This is a beautiful picture somebody took during our expedition there a couple of years ago. This is one place I always wanted to go, this Lake Mafani. Never made it up there. It probably ended up over here somewhere. It was just been hammered by a cyclone and never recovered, or even our advance party didn't reach that. So I'll never get up there probably. It's probably intact because it's far away, it's high elevation, it's cold, there's very little economic incentive because the trees there are short or not woody species. It'd be too hard to extract them. So it's safe, generally safe, but there are inroads being made in that still, even though it's relatively safe. So there's me as a Peace Corps volunteer having a aso tonai, the aso tamaiti tonai. Yeah, it's hard to recognize. Barefooted, I've got a Band-Aid on. I had been, I think, hiking, and I kicked a stone when I was looking at plants, I think. Anyway, I was in Peace Corps for 3 years and teaching biology. And then I just started, in 1971, a hobby. I just started collecting plants. I needed a reason to get a visa to extend my stay. And I didn't realize at the time it would take me 44 years to run this hobby out. Then the last 2 years, finally, the National Tropical Botanical Garden, who I used to work for, funded me for the last 2 years. Well, 3 now. They haven't funded me this year, but I'm supposed to have finished a year ago. So the draft is in. Only problem is I don't think they agree with the way I name plants, so we'll have to work that out. Now, to do this project, I divided it into 5 steps. Any flora would follow the same 5 steps. You have the early collections. Before the flora was even written, people didn't know the plants at all, they just collected. New collections, that was by me in this case. Studying literature, this is done at the same time. Seeing all the known specimens and writing the flora itself. So I divided this into 5 phases. This is like a botanical history of Samoa. And I divided these 5 stages: the exploratory phase, the amateur phase, European phase, American phase, and modern phase. The first collections that still exist were in 1838, and since that time there's probably been 17,000 specimens collected, not counting duplicates. I've got about 5,000 of those myself, or I did. I had to give those to the garden when I did my flora. So the first exploratory phase, 1787 to 1840. In 1787, the La Perouse expedition landed in Tutuila, and they got into some kind of disagreement, and there was a battle, and 9 French soldiers were killed, and a number of Samoans didn't record that. But the botanist heroically had a bag of plants on his back, and he swam out in a hail of stones to the ship. So those are the first collections from Samoa. But unfortunately, that ship that expedition, a couple of months later, disappeared, and they didn't find the remains of it until 20 years later. It ran aground somewhere in Vanuatu, and everybody apparently was killed, or they weren't living by the 20 years later. So there's only 3 expeditions in this phase. The last one was the U.S. exploring expedition, 1839 to 1840. Amateur phase, there were 3 significant botanists between 1840 and 1893. They weren't even they were amateurs. They were the 2 of them, Reverend Thomas Powell and James Whitney, actually helped write the Samoan dictionary. They were missionaries, but in their spare time they made collections. And then there was a Swiss naturalist named Edouard Griffet. He spent 12 years in Samoa, Tonga, and Fiji collecting specimens, but none of these men published their work. That's why they were amateurs. They were doing other things as well, so they just formed the basis of the early collections. The European phase, I would say from 1893 to 1920, and this is started out by the German botanist Franz Reinecke, who collected for 3 years in Samoa, and he did the first so-called flora of the islands, the Flora of Samoa in 1898. Unfortunately, his first set of specimens were destroyed during World War II, so those were lost. A second botanist, he was a doctor, wasn't a botanist, he was a physician, Friedrich Faupel. He collected in 1904 to 1906, and unfortunately his first set of collections was lost as well, but he did make extensive duplicates. But the problem with his duplicates is they're not real duplicates. They're the same number, but different dates and everything, so it's a big mess. You can't just cite his specimens because there might be 6 different dates, six different collections. And the last one, Carl Reckinger, he was on his round-the-world honeymoon. He went to Samoa for about 6 months, and he made, up to that time, the largest collection, about 2,000 specimens. And almost all his specimens are still intact in Vienna, where I've been several times. That's not Vienna, that's Munich. So the loss of all these early specimens has been a real problem for me, because you just don't know what they are sometimes if they weren't properly identified. The American phase is characterized by American or American-sponsored botanists, and the first of this phase was Erling Kristofferson. He was in Samoa on 2 trips between 1929 and 1931, and his collections have he had about 2,530 specimens, which is, until I started collecting, that was the biggest collection, and these are stored at the Bishop Museum. He, unlike the earlier people, published an account of his specimens. Really wasn't the flora in 1935 and 1938. There are no descriptions in it or keys, so you can't really use it to identify anything. It's just a record of that species occurring in Samoa. A few years before that, William Setchell, who was a phycologist, he was in Tutuila, and he decided to collect flowering plants and ferns, and he published a flora of the island of Tutuila. After those 2, Thomas Junker, botanist from Ohio, somewhere in Ohio, I think. He collected specimens from the Manua Islands and wrote what he was called a flora, but again, it was just a list of specimens, so none of these are floras. Then, for some reason, I guess probably the war started the war, there was almost no collections between 1940 and 1968 except B.V. Parham. That's the only major collections I've seen during this time. The modern phase, 1968 to present, that's when I went to Samoa. I have only a couple of specimens from that time. I just was collecting for my biology class. But in earnest, I started in 1971. So most of the collections from Samoa have been in the last 49 years. And I have, as I said, I have about 500 collections of mine, and this represents 94% of the known native flora. So that means I haven't collected 6%. I never will collect, for several reasons. Some of these may have gone extinct. Some of them have been incorrect records, and some are I just haven't run into them because they're up in the high forest area. I only been up there 3 or 4 times, maybe 6 times. So on my work, I published this book on rainforest trees, so that's recent, and it had full description, so it was technically a lowland tree flora. And A.C. Smith, who did the Flora of Fiji, did a number of publications on Fijian plants, and he discussed the Samoan ones in that genus. So he'd do the genus Diosporus and put all the Fijian ones and the Samoan ones in. Second step, making new collections. This picture on the top shows my Fijian colleague, Isaac. We're working, this is just about 3 or 4 years ago. So sometimes you have to prepare the specimens in the field. So you collect the specimens, and if you don't go down, you don't want to leave them around bags, so you have to fix them up in the field. In the better situations, we come back during the day or in the afternoon and have much better conditions to dry the plants. Now, the hardest part of making the specimens is finding a dryer. And this was always a problem. We used light bulbs sometimes. This actually uses 3 high wattage light bulbs. And I started using this after a few years, this dryer made of cinder blocks with light bulbs in there. And it works quite well when it's closed up properly. Yeah. Hardest part is drying the specimens. And here's, once the specimens are in newspaper, they're dried. And my set, I pressed all my set, and then I sent a lot of duplicates out over the years. And the specimens are then glued to a sheet of paper, a label is put on them, and they're stored in cabinets. Under these conditions, they can last almost forever. I have specimens from Griffey, actually. It was sent to me by, was it Berlin? Berlin or Hamburg. And they are from 1860, so over 150 years old. Third step, studying literature. I mentioned these collectors, all of them. You can look these up if you're interested. Now, none of these are real floras since they're incomplete. Some of them are too small, like Manaaki. He was the first major collector, well, first systematic major collector. He only got 54% of the currently recognized species. And most of their reports covered only their own specimens. They didn't talk about any plants that other people collected, so you'd have to look in the literature for each one separately. Some collected only part of the archipelago, even though they called it a flora. Most of them lack descriptions, and almost all of them lack taxonomic keys. And they're out of date, so that's one reason the flora needed to be done. It just was never done properly. Most of the surrounding islands have flora. Hawaii had a big flora in 1990. So Samoa is, 25 years behind that. Now, the fourth part of doing the flora, I have to look at all the specimens that have been collected before, because I haven't collected some of them, and if they didn't write up the report, I wouldn't even know that. So there was a guy named Betchy in 1881. He collected on Upolu only, and he got something like this. The plant, there's just one little miserable specimen of it in Melbourne, but this is something in the same genus. So this is what I call my holy grail of Samoan botany. This is a plant I want to find one plant still, that's the one. Just a little thing, tiny thing apparently. I assume it's a terrestrial species called Coryanthes betchii. I've never seen Sixbeckia in Samoa. It last collected there in 1931. So apparently it disappeared because modern weeds outcompeted it. And the third one I've collected only once or twice in Samoa, last time in perhaps 1860. I've only seen this plant once or twice in the Cook Islands. It's still grown there as a medicinal plant. So the best collections are at Kew. This is the mecca of taxonomy in London. Bishop Museum in Honolulu. I spent a lot of time there. Smithsonian in DC. British Museum in London, and the National Tropical Botanical Garden, now that they have my 5,000 specimens. So I've been to most of the herbaria. There's about 15 or 17. I've been to 15 of them, looking at all their specimens. So I've made an effort to see every specimen ever collected in Samoa. The last part is writing the flora. And most floras are written from previous descriptions or from dry material. But since I was in the field so much, and I have a field book, I would always write up descriptions while I was in the field. So this is going to make it hopefully more accurate than other floras. But I combine this sometimes with previously written descriptions, change the measurements and so forth, and come up with a new description for the plant. And also, I have to write taxonomic keys. It turns out there's about 190 taxonomic keys that'll be in the book. And this is a simple taxonomic key on the right to the palms of Samoa. You have choices. One, is it plant tall canopy species, or is it a understory palm, and so forth. So I did 190 of these keys. And my descriptions look like this. I try to standardize them all, so once you get familiar with it, all of them will be the same. Everything will be in the same order. It's a little difficult when you have grasses and things, you have different terms. But this is a standard angiosperm description. It's not in yellow in the book, of course, but it's in bold. So each of the categories, if you're looking just for the inflorescence, you can easily find it. And what I put at the end, which the editors didn't really like, but it's, to me, for people that are going to read the flora, a little paragraph that simply describes the plant, just because most people don't want to read the whole description. I was debating whether to put this one in or not, but nomenclature is the naming of plants. And this is one of the hardest parts. It's the most frustrating part for me because lately I have all these DNA studies. It's sort of taken over the field of taxonomy. It's very, very useful, but it seems that some of the people that write these things have never even seen the plant. So they have there's no basis to what the plant looks like. It's only what their DNA is. So I'm caught in the middle of this because the editors want to be on the crest of the wave, and I want to be able to have people will know that to look for sterculia in the sterculiaceae, not in the malvaceae where it's put these days. So that's being sorted out right now. Anyway, so much for that. Okay, so I'm going to go into the flora here now. We've got all the preliminary stuff. All species of Samoa are either native or alien species. Native are ones that arrived naturally in Samoa, and almost all those arrived before the first explorers. In fact, when the Samoans first discovered Samoa, every plant in Samoa was a native species at that time. The other type, alien or introduced, are species that are not of a natural occurrence in an island. And this can be subdivided several ways. One is when it was introduced. If it was introduced prior to the Europeans in Samoa about 1830, then it's called a Polynesian introduction. If it's after that date, I call it a modern introduction. If it was intentionally introduced, then it's an intentional introduction, like a crop plant, or if it's unintentional, like a weed, it's called an unintentional introduction. It's very simple. Here's two examples. This is a Morphophallus, which is the stink lily. It's a Polynesian introduction to Samoa. Mecania micrantha, Fuisina they call it. They blame the Chinese for this because it appeared in Samoa about the same time as the Chinese did, but it probably didn't come with them, especially since it's a tropical American species. So the flora is going to include all the native species plus all the Polynesian introduction that are naturalized. That's a self-reproducing population. They have paper pulberry for making clothing and so forth, but it doesn't flower fruit, and if you don't plant it, it doesn't grow, it disappears. So the flora will have all the native and the naturalized plants of Samoa. Some floras put in ornamentals, like the Cook Islands flora, but I didn't want to do that. It would take up too much space, and it's changing all the time. Now, that's one of my favorite trees, obviously, on the right. I found that as a flower on the ground. I was hiking in Savaii in 1975, and funny, there was a New Zealand, no, he's in New Zealand now, entomologist asked me later, is there any Malvaceae up at this elevation? I said, no, but I found a flower of it. I don't know what it is. Anyway, so a summary of the flora of Samoa has 96 native families, as I define the native families, 303 genera, native species 541, so that means less than 2 species per genus on the average. Of these, 186 are endemic to Samoa, which is an endemism rate of 34%. And another 30 plants are Polynesian introduction weeds, and another about 280, so that's a huge number, of modern introductions. There's lots of new weeds that have come into Samoa over the last 150 years. Now, if you want to compare this to other islands, Niue has 224 species, 124 genera, with no endemic species. It's just too recent an island. It came out of the sea. It's a limestone island. Tonga with 340 species, 248 genera, and 4% endemism because it's mostly low islands and they're near Fiji and Samoa. And Samoa's there. Fiji, 1,307. It's a lot more than that now, I'm sure. And 62% endemic rate. And Hawaii, with a few less, but astonishing 89% of the plants that were there when the first Hawaiians arrived are found only in Hawaii. Only 2 genera are endemic to Samoa. One of them is Sarco pygmy. This, the people that wrote up the genus gave 5 species, but I've determined, I think, that all 5 are just different variation in the size of the fruit based on elevation. I just call it 2 now, maybe it's only 1. The second one, Sulfia whitmianus, is a monotypic genus, but in both cases, DNA people are trying to put these back into different genera, but I'm not going to at this stage. So where did Samoa get its flora? So Samoa rose out of the sea 2 million years ago, and over time, the vegetation developed as the soil was formed, erosion and so forth, and the mountains got higher and higher. So you have 2 million years of plants arriving. So all the plants, this is an oceanic island group. That means it's never had any connection with any other land group. So all the plants found there had to come across the water or in the air. So that's long distance dispersal. There's 3 ways this happens. Seawater dispersed. This is fish poison tree, Barringtonia asiatica, and that's all, that forest is all literal forest made of Barringtonia. So that's seawater dispersal. These seeds have to live a long time. They have to be immune to destruction by water. They have to be able to survive long distance voyages floating in the ocean. These species on beaches are called littoral. Another second method is wind-borne fruits, and there's 3 different adaptations for this. Some have little wings, which is the center one. That's Dodonea viscosa. It's a native Samoan plant. So the wind, it allows the fruit to be blown during cyclones long distances. The first one there is parachute fruits. There's not too many of these in Samoa. This is actually a weed, but there is one genus, Hoya, that has these seeds. And the most common one is by having very, very small seeds. That's an orchid fruit. And there's 99 species of orchids, so it's very successful. Most of them got there by long distance dispersal. Probably a few developed locally. Seeds are commonly dispersed by birds. This is not a Samoan bird, actually, but it's a nice photograph of a bird eating a fleshy fruit. They're usually orange or yellow. The one in the middle is a native Samoan tree. You probably recognize this genus. It's a New Zealand genus, Pittosporum. And this is the #1 method of dispersal for the rainforest trees. So they're dispersed by either birds or bats. The fruits can be inside if the bird eats it, or it can be outside. This is these use littoral plants. This white tern is covered with these sticky fruits of Pisonia here. This is not very common. There's only 2 or 3 plants that I know actually that have sticky seeds. So the second question is, where did the native plants come from? The source of the Samoan flora is mostly from Indo-Malaysia area. So most, I think 2/3 of the Samoan plants are found in Fiji. Anyway, this Malaysia here, Indo-Malaysia here. So this is, most of the genera are from here. Now you'd think it would be the opposite way because the winds are prevailing from the southeast and the currents. So the currents and the wind are both coming from this direction, and yet almost all the plants have actually reached Samoa from the west. There's this is an interesting one, Sapindus. There's a native South American species. It's native to Hawaii. It could be Vidiensis, I'm not sure. It's the genus. Apparently came from South America. There's also an austral element comprised of species with origins in the southern hemisphere. These are mostly montane species. So if you knew the Samoan, or knew the New Zealand flora very well, if you were in rainforest, lowland rainforest, you wouldn't recognize many of the plants. You might get the families, but you wouldn't get the genera even. If you end up on the top of Hawaii, you would be right at home. Most of the trees up there have analogs in New Zealand. So just to test you, I'll just bring these out one by one. The first one, anybody recognize that? No, the first one here. This one here. Whoops, so fast. Okay. Weinmannia. I just saw that the other day. And the second, wow, how did all those come up? That's no fair. All right, you didn't see that. There we go, Weinmannia. What's the second one? Coprosma. 2 species in Samoa at the highest elevations only, nothing below 4,000 feet, 300, 1,000 meters or more. The third one? Hedycaria. Yeah. And the fourth one? That's Disoxylum. So I know it's one. Is that right? There's a Disoxylum here? Yeah. Okay. All right. And this one, we saw this outside the door. Yeah, I was surprised to see this on Rangi, what's the island? Rangitoto, yeah. It's a shrub up at the highest elevations of 1,600 meters in Samoa. And this one, I have not seen this. Well, I have seen it actually. The middle one is Meliacope. And that one, you probably recognize by the fringed petals, Eliocarpus. There's one high elevation species, but there's actually low elevation species as well. This one, Melocidus. And this one is pretty obvious, Piper, and of course this one, Metrosideros. So most of these plants occur at their high elevations, and you would feel more at home botanizing up there. Now there's some mysteries to the flora, and these are my 3 favorite ones. This tree on the left is Cereanthes melanesica, and the one in the middle is Solanum amicorum. They were collected by Whitney in the 1880s, supposedly, but I think that since they were never collected again, he went to Tonga on a trip, came back and collected plants there, put them in a Samoan collection, sent them to Kew, and they just listed everything from Samoa. Cereanthes is not a tree that would disappear very easily and not have a name or anything. And, well, this one, the Solanum, could disappear because, well, there's a native Solanum, but this is even rare now in Tonga. Both of them are found in Vava'u, so I suspect that Whitney went to Vava'u. This last one, Rubus mollicanus, is a blackberry. It's native to Fiji. I just found a specimen of it about 3 months ago in Hamburg. So his collections are known to have errors in it, so I assume that's a Fijian species. So I've left that one out. I've reluctantly put the other 2 in the flora. A couple of others are misleading. The one on the left is Baccaria titensis, which means Baccaria from Tahiti. The one in the middle is Balaka titensis, the same thing. Both of them are endemic to Samoa because the U.S. exploring expedition mixed up their specimens. I even saw, I think it was in Auckland, I went through the collections there, I found a Psychotra insularum from Samoa listed in the New Zealand collections. So I don't think there's any Psychotra in New Zealand, is there? Yeah. That's a mushroom. For a long time I thought it was a flowering plant because an expert told me it was a root parasite flowering plant, but finally found it and found gills on it, so removed it. Another problem is determining whether a plant is native or not. And my colleague Bill Sykes, who everybody knows here, and I had a discussion about this because he thought this was native to Niue. But after we discussed it for a while and I looked through the first Niue collections, the most dominant forest tree was not in the first collections. The same as Samoa, it was first collected in 1905. So all the early people missed it. I've collected it probably 20 times. So best guess is introduced by the Germans as a timber tree, an experimental timber tree. The one in the middle, Drypetes vidiense, I was the first one to collect that. I've collected maybe 10 times, but it's very obscure. Looks a lot like a Diosporus, so I think it just was missed. And the one on the right, Eliocarpus floridanus, it's a very common tree, but first time it was collected in 1905. So those 3, the first and the third one, I'm considering modern introductions, but they're naturalized. Now, I've talked about the plants getting to Samoa by long-distance dispersal, but also you have evolution and adaptive radiation. Now this may look like a case for it. These are 3 Scaevola species. Scaevola ticata is on the beaches, a very common beach plant, and a well-known one at the top of Savaii is Scaevola nubigena. Well, in 1992, I found this one, specimen on Upolu. I just listed it with the other one, but when I looked at the photographs later, I said, wow, there's not anything like it. It's quite a bit different. So that's going to be a new species in the flora, Scaevola samoense. But these 2 species probably came in separately, unrelated to Takata. But almost all, Fiji and most of the high islands of Polynesia have high elevation scaevolas, but they don't usually evolve from the coastal one, so it's a bit of an anomaly. The largest flowering plants in Samoa, orchids, 99 species. Rubiaceae, it's coffee family, 46. The nettle family, pea family, myrtle family, Euphorbiaceae. That'll be changed now because they've split Euphorbiaceae up a bit. And Poaceae, which includes Polynesian introductions, because they're so hard to tell if they're Polynesian introductions or native grasses. That's my favorite tree in Samoa. It's called Afa. That's my Samoan name, so it's my totem. But a lot of the species have been formed by adaptive radiation, particularly in several genera. And this genus is Sertandra. There are about 21 species of it, so there have been a number of natural introduction arrivals, but there's also been a lot of speciation. So it originally arrived as an indigenous species from somewhere else, but if it changes sufficiently, then it becomes endemic. So this genus now has 21 species. 20 of them are endemic. One is also found in Tonga and Niue. Psychotria, it used to be the biggest genus until I revised them, and there are 20 species, 17 of them found nowhere else in the world. 3 of them are found in Fiji, Tonga, or Niue. Largest families of Orchidaceae, I mentioned that before. 99 species, 19% of the whole flora are orchids, so they're very successful colonizers. This compares to, nobody believes this when I tell them, there's only 3 native species in Hawaii, because everybody thinks of Hawaii as having orchids, because they're all brought in. So they spread by tiny spores. That's your takeaway fact for the day. 3 orchid species in Hawaii. And there's quite a variety of them. You have epiphytic orchids, probably 60% are epiphytic, they grow on trees. And probably more endangered ones are the terrestrial orchids, which grow on the forest floor. Here's some 5th largest genus. These are dendrobiums, leafless dendrobium. This is a very common one on coconut trees, even in plantations at low elevation. This one I've named a new species. This is actually the old species. They had the better picture. I had to put that one in. But the Samoan one is a different color and different shape. In fact, all 99 of these orchid species in Samoa have no name. The only word used is okeki, which is just a transliteration of orchid. So people call them limu, or my theory is if there's no use, there's no name. So most are very small and way up in the tree. Just want to mention palms. There's 3 genera, Balaka, Sulphia, and Clinostigma, all have endemic species, and coconut is probably indigenous. So the flora is very well collected, if not published. These are 3 species that I've named in recent times. This orchid here, I collected this about 3 years ago. I only saw one of them up at 1,500 meters elevation next to a bulldozed road. And it was quite unique for a phaius. It has several different stems coming out from the base. And I sent it to my colleague, and he just happened to be working on calanthe, so he named that one Calanthe whistleri. There's some plants that are very rare, very interesting. This one, Dioclea wilsoni, is only known from a single hill on Tutuila, very top of a trachyte plug. Only place it's ever been found, and it's hard to understand. It's, the occasional collections of Fiji, Tahiti, Hawaii, but it's a very rare plant, but only one place in Samoa it's known from. Blumia milnei used to be probably a Polynesian weed, but it disappeared because of all the new weeds coming in. Hasn't been collected since 1905 probably, maybe 1895. This is a Polynesian tomato. It's a Polynesian introduction, Solanum ferox, last collected in 1905. So this is some of the problems of disappearing plants, the disappearing flora of Samoa. There are new plants to be found. We had an expedition last year. I found this new Meleocope that I'm naming in the flora. And this was a puzzle because my colleague had put this one in our orchid flora of Samoa, and I thought he was wrong because he made a mistake in it. So I was going to remove it and say, don't pay attention to crib and whistler, they don't know what they're talking about. But then I found this one in Savaii, different island, and it's a different colored one than the one over here. This is the common one in Fiji. What's it called? Macrantha, can't remember now. Anyway, it's a dendrobium. So found two new species, or at least a new variety and a new species, just from one day up on a different part of Hawaii. So there's probably lots more things up there, but I'll never make it up there again. That was probably my last collecting trip to Samoa, but you never know. So there are threats to the Samoan flora. These are natural and man-made factors, but the natural threats to the flora and the vegetation are cyclones and occasionally fire. Fire is usually because it burns cultivated areas and forestry plots that are not native species. Man-made factors, introduction of animals that destroy habitat. Way up at the top of Hawaii at 1,600 meters elevation, I found this cat skull. Overkill of birds. The man on the right picture there, he's got 3 or 4 lupe, Pacific pigeons, when they're getting very rare, but they still shoot them. Introduction of aggressive weeds, complete with native species. Well, I had that before, well, I'll mention that in a moment. Also, the flying foxes are major forest dispersers of seeds. They've been killed off, but now they're protected, so I think they're on the road to recovery. And this guy, a friend of mine, he's the only pig hunter in American Samoa, or in his village anyway. Samoans don't do it much anymore because it's very dangerous and whatnot. So the pigs probably running more free than they used to be. So pigs do a lot of damage to the environment. But fortunately, there are no goats or sheep in Samoa. Alien weeds, I mentioned this one earlier. Milo-minute weed is the most common weed in Samoa. It just covers everything when you clear a plantation. The one in the middle, that's Coster's curse. I first collected that in Upolu in 1979. Now it's the dominant understory shrub in high montane forest. And the one on the right, everybody's upset about this, calling it a weed, but actually it's a native species. It's just that they cut the forest down and this vine, Maremia, covers it. It's not really a weed per se, it's just a part of the natural succession. There's some bad trees. The tree on the left is an African rubber tree. I've seen forests that had nothing but that tree in it. And a little bit less common, but also overrunning parts of forests, especially Upolu. All 3 of these, especially on Upolu, which is much better, deeper soil. They don't do so well in the rocky soil of Hawaii. That's a type of a South American rubber tree, and then of course Spathodia, African tulip tree, is probably the worst one in recent times. It's really spreading very rapidly in secondary forest. So this removes habitat and probably causes extinction of some species. This is a picture of the 2 islands, Upolu and Hawaii, how they estimated the native forest cover in 1953 and 1990. You can see how different it is over those years because of forestry and forest clearing for a number of purposes. But you can see almost all the coastal area around Hawaii is now removed, but it's still intact at the higher elevations. And Upolu, probably 80 or 90% now has been removed, just in the highest elevations, steepest places, and one little area in the coast here, which is kind of rugged coast. So this is real sad to see this happen. So I want to finish up here. I should do the next one first. Takeaways from this presentation. This is actually a picture from Tonga. The Flora of Samoa is probably best. Couldn't find any good closing picture from Samoa because of the damage. Actually, Tonga is much more deforestation, like 100% of this island, Tongatapu. Flora of Samoa is most intact flora in Polynesia, at least in tropical Polynesia. The vegetation is probably the least disturbed of any of the tropical Polynesian islands. Has 541 native flowering plant species. Some of the species have disappeared, not many, but more will probably in the future as all these introduced forces, these disturbances, wreak havoc on the flora and the vegetation. Endemism rate is 34%. In the last 190 years, about 260 weedy species have become established. These aren't so bad typically. If it's a closed forest, you don't see them very often. There's almost no weeds in the closed forest at high elevations. And no one seems to be working on it. I've been doing this for 45 years, waiting for someone to take my place. And I had last time I gave a presentation to DMWR, I told the Samoans there, "Ualuatu leafi." The fire is going to the other side now, but I don't know if it is. Nobody's really interested in this. There's just, if you're academic, you want to be a doctor or lawyer. There's not much of an opportunity for botanists. You know, someone can only handle one real botanist probably. Going back to the two people that helped me most in the field, this is Talie Folinga. His mother was a healer, is a mother. His mother is still a healer on Savaii. And he was a forestry officer, and he went out with you so many times, so it's great working in the field with him. And the other guy is Fijian, and we were working in the field, and he knew the trees better than the forestry officers in the forestry program, because they only knew the commercial species. Nobody learns the native species. Anyway, I want to acknowledge the two people as the ones that helped me the most in the field. That's it.